I would say the beginning of the web. And I wasn't at Mozilla at the beginning of the web. In fact, Mozilla wasn't Mozilla at the beginning of the web, but certainly I was doing internet stuff back in 94 when the Netscape browser came out. I was running a web hosting company, web development company. And it was so exciting. Like, all of a sudden, you didn't need to like put out a zine or put out a CD-ROM or whatever it was. Just put your stuff up and people could come get it. And it was kind of cheap and kind of easy and everybody could do it. And it's like all of a sudden, that's sort of where it feels like we're at with generative AI. This crazy stuff. We've been talking about AI for a long time. We use it for particular business applications in the background. But now like anybody can kind of go and like make it do stuff. And that's kind of an exciting moment. It's also kind of a kludgy, clumsy moment when I think back to that in the web, right? It's all going to be like this. And I think that sometimes is how you feel with chat GPT or these kind of things. But like it is the kind of adolescent stage. Like probably a lot of listeners are younger than me, but there was the blink tag where, wow, I can make a thing blink on a page, which is different than putting something, printing something out, or, just early e-commerce or early personalization. And it was from the mid 90s, through to, I don't know, the early aughts to the Facebook, the Gmail kind of era, 10 years of working out how do we want this experience of the web to provide utility to people. And that meant figuring out, UX paradigms and UI paradigms, like how does it actually going to work? What are we going to use it for? It's good for social, it's good for e-commerce, but only in these cases. How do we do personalization and make it be something that is responsive to me? How do I guide it? And so I think all of those questions really about like, what's it for? Who gets to use it for what? And like, how do we actually build experiences from it? We are just in the very earliest of days. Well, I think, when you think back to how hard it is to look at it ahead, and, there's a quote I love from Marshall McLuhan, which is, we tend to see the future through the rearview mirror. And so it's kind of hard sitting now to know what it's going to be. It's also hard to know like what's going to go wrong. So if I think back to the beginning of the web, we didn't see, social media coming even in the same way we did, or the kinds of personalization or what it means for the web to have transformed into smartphones and be with us everywhere. We also didn't see misinformation and a level of annoyance and invasion of our privacy that was going to come. Like it just wasn't on people's minds.
Yeah.
So I think we want to be looking to the future of AI, both on the, what is it that could happen? Where's the value? And also what could go wrong? The value might be, I imagine we're going to have very quickly, we're already starting to see them, really much more personalized experiences. Like I'm not listening, and you've already seen companies like this come out. I'm not just listening to Spotify recommendations, but I'm listening to like a whole radio show that feels like a radio show. It's got, AI actors or hosts or whatever. That's the radio show I want. And, I'm driving down the road and it says, yeah, there's traffic 2 minutes ahead. I mean, it's kind of like Google Maps as a radio show. And then it's also playing the stuff that I love. And it's kind of, that's maybe just one simple, easy to deliver example. But I think we're just going to see hyper personalization, and a lot of it is going to feel great. And then on the other side, I think you're going to see a bunch that has gone wrong with the internet so far get reflected for some of the same reasons, right? As we get to hyper personalization, somebody's got to make money off it. And the incentives to treat my data well, or to treat me well, or to, kind of make sure that it's an experience that respects me, they're not necessarily always there. And so, you're going to have to really watch out for the kind of problems we've seen around filter bubbles, misinformation, polarization actually get worse in the world of hyper personalization. It's interesting because you covered a pretty wide range.
I did, yeah.
And I want to more riff off those. I mean, there's other places, obviously, right? Which is all of the stuff in terms of personal assistance or like things that aid me. I mean, they kind of almost become like my super suit or my cape as I go through. So if I have things like Copilot, which already exists, where it can like help me write software faster or help me write a thing faster, summarize the things for the executives, I think things that almost feel like assistants that make me go faster are a kind of hyper personalization that will make a big impact in the workplace. And in many ways, like you see reports coming out, like there's a lot of stuff on jobs and kind of people worrying about what job loss is happening. The other piece is to think about, like, once I have that superpower, that hopefully I get to do the more interesting work. Like one of the things we've talked a lot about, or you read a lot about, is lawyers being, a big area where there's a risk of job loss. But there's a lot of drudgery in being a lawyer. So like imagine if the AI did the drudgery and you got to do the creative, intellectual, difficult, all of that kind of strategic stuff. And so I think that's a thing to watch for too, is like, how do I build that personalized superpower around me as a professional, as a worker? And then how do I actually think, for the kind of people listening to this podcast, people who are looking at deploying AI, to imagine as a trend and a thing to think about in the next few years? The thing I would say is, all this feels, when you look, think about generative AI, that things are moving hyper fast and we're at a tipping point. True. But it's also really important to remember we're so early, like in the early web, in terms of what these things can really do. So a lot of the things I just said and you just said, there's very clear problems we face with this age, or this kind of wave of generative AI ready, that are kind of will hold us back, or we're not ready yet. So if you just think about, using any of these chatbots, they give you a disclaimer, this is only up to date as of September 2021,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
built. Hyper personalization is not going to work well until we can have hyper contextualized training data that can kind of work closely with these deeper models. And so it's a ways before that works well. And then similarly, you see where these chatbots like make stuff up, or they hallucinate, is the kind of term that is starting to get used. And if you're preparing summaries for executives in this hyper personalized way, the hallucination is not going to be one. And I would say one thing to really watch out for in terms of the use of AI, these kind of generative tools in business, is where they feel like they're ready for prime time, and being critical about whether they are ready for prime time. Because what you're going to see is, like we saw 20 years ago, or 20 years ago in Linux and a bunch of stuff, or 10 years ago in cloud computing, the shadow IT department that just uses what's cool, even though it's not vetted for the business, is going to be the shadow AI department. People are going to start using this stuff, whatever rules you say. And so you got to really be ready to both encourage creativity, but be critical about what's ready for prime time. No, definitely not. And I think even a ways to go to build the tech and the tooling and the business processes, even to have that kind of hyper, tight, narrow traditional training data and that confidence threshold. And I'll say we just launched last month a company called Mozila AI, which is going to be our R&D group, focused on building stuff, tooling in that space, right? It's really, the phrase we've got is making it easy to build trustworthy AI into anything. And it means, like, when I'm a developer or I'm running a business process, it shouldn't be hard for me to be able to bring in that contextual training data. It should be easy. It shouldn't be hard for me to check that confidence threshold, whether it's about compliance or about user impact. And that's not yet where we see people investing in the kind of rushing, move fast and break things world. So we really want to help fill that gap and make it easy for people deploying these systems to have that confidence and to consider users. Well, let me say a few things on that. Hopefully, the human body and the human psyche is smart enough to at least tell the AI that my relaxation level is better when I still go for a walk. So
Yes.
even if the AI is telling me to go for a walk, hopefully I still use my body and I'm not just plugged into the matrix. I mean, that is a dystopian feeling. So, and I'm actually partly optimistic that, we'll be smart enough to shape this, or the people who develop it will shape experiences that, like a Fitbit, but on hyper steroids, actually help me enjoy being a human better. So like, you can try to be optimistic about that. I would say two things, maybe three big things to watch out for. One is, the first era of the internet is not optimistic. Well, that's maybe a little harsh. it's been a mixed bag, right? Because it's connected us. Like we're connected to our friends everywhere. Like we get a lot of joy from the internet. Like I love it. I'm still a big internet fan, of course.
Yep, yep.
But we also have really seen, in my view, it erode our political discourse and certainly addict us a little bit. You see movies like The Social Dilemma, and that really has to do with what is the system optimized for. And when you have a system that is just optimized for selling enough ads to help share prices go up, you're going to get stuff that's not good for us and certainly not designed in our interests. So imagine you take what you said and you take where we're already headed with AI, that a few companies are dominating it. I mean, OpenAI is pretty much owned by Microsoft. There's a few players. If share price drives the kind of deep hyper personalization that we're doing, like in whose interest will we be operating? And that worries me a lot as we're going, right? I mean, it's likely that Amazon, Microsoft, and Google and maybe Apple and maybe Facebook are those ecosystems. And so, how do we actually make sure as a society that there's a better chance than not that those things are good for us? And I would just say, you know, two things. One is it's a reason that this what kind of feels like a old internet debate of the moment in Washington or in Brussels around competition really matters because I believe anyways, if you have more players in the marketplace, the incentives to actually treat people better are just kind of built in. So I do think like competition policy on tech may sound like a nerdy DC belt, inside the beltway thing, but it matters for human experience of this next wave of AI. And then the other thing I would say is we really have lost, and we like to think that we can be one of these, we really lost the idea of, trusted institutions we have in society to have our back. And so I like to think that we can rebuild some of those, whether that's like the consumer watchdogs of the world or, other people we trusted. And if we can build those institutions that they can run personal AI services that kind of represent us.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly the way we think about it, is tilt towards our agency. I mean, there's different incentives in society. It's still society. There's still power dynamics. But how do we tilt towards our agency? And some of that is, enough incentives and frankly, enough shift in this, going back to this question of UX and UI, like how do we build for this? People who are developers and founders of companies who are thinking about and innovating in how to design for user agency. Sounds very abstract, but like I think we'll feel what that looks like in 5 years, in 10 years, is designing for user agency where I'm making choices. And then do products come out, which is a place that we want to go eventually, that allow you to kind of have this personal AI that is your user agent. In some ways, it's the browser on hyper steroids that is a counterparty to all these other AIs. And that's the thing to remember, is we're already outgunned. Like the cognitive ability of us to process the amount of automated stuff coming at us is already low and, are just kind of imbalanced. And so, do we build, software that we trust is run by a party we trust to be the counterparty to everything that's coming at us? And I think without that, we're actually in a tough spot. It's a space that's got to emerge. I not only do I see it as realistic and necessary, and you want to balance, innovation and regulation and all those things. I also just see it as the natural cycle of history. Any form of innovation feels like the Wild West, right? If you think about cars in 150 years ago, almost now 125 years ago, this is a total Wild West. It's just being invented out of people's brains and out of people's factories. There's no rules. There's no rules of the road.
No
There's no rules of
seatbelts.
safety. Right. Any of those things. And even take seatbelts. It takes 75, 80 years before Ralph Nader gets us to kind of put it into a law. 80 years for a technology, that defined the 20th century. And so I think we're now just getting to the beginning of those questions of what is competition? What is safety? What is fairness? What are all these things? Like, we should move with haste, and governments are, but we also, I don't think, should panic that like, oh my God, we didn't regulate it. That wasn't the right time. Or, oh my God, we're going to kill ourselves by regulating. it's not like we don't have safer cars today now that we had seatbelt laws 50 years ago.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And then the kind of society, let's look at it optimistically for a while, as opposed to just dystopically.
Yeah.
The cycle of innovation, internalization of what it should become, how are we build societal norms, like it takes time and it goes through cycles. And if I'm optimistic, we're going to tackle that. And so we have to not be afraid to like make those balances in society, but we know how to do it.